Herkese tekrar hoş geldiniz. It's been a long day, and me being a teacher, when I start class, I want everyone to pay attention, so we go. I've talked with the organizing committee, and we all felt that it would be better if we all speak the same language. That way, less is lost in translation, so I will be speaking in English as well. And on the topic of language, before I forget, I want to send a big thank you to the interpreters who have been through this rough day. It's not an easy job, and I want to thank them for their efforts. Now, we felt that during the day we had some speakers from Turkey, some from abroad, but we felt that we should have one last panel devoted totally to people from abroad, because we in Turkey talk with each other all the time about our troubles and our wishes, our hopes and our aspirations, but we want to hear our panelists one more time. So I want to thank all of you for being here again. And I want to start with Douglas Johnson, because among the panelists, he's the one who hasn't had a chance to speak at all today, and I want to introduce him to you. I won't spend time on introducing the other panelists because that's been done already. Doug has been a committed human rights advocate since the 1970s, when he chaired the Infant Formula Action Coalition, and which launched a boycott against the world's largest food corporation, Nestle. He served in Latin America. In 1988, he started working for the Center for the Victims of Torture. He raised an impressive amount of funding for that. And he initiated the new tactics in the Human Rights Project, which I will ask you to comment on when we go into the questions. So, Doug, you were one of the pioneers of grassroots boycotts against rights violator companies. And in the past decade, we have witnessed an increasing awareness on the accountability of corporations, such as the Occupy Wall Street movement. And my first question to you is, how do you think social justice and human rights complement each other? And do you think there's enough human rights activism on issues surrounding economic inequality?
Yes, I believe that social justice and human rights are the same struggle. And in fact, human rights are an attempt to clarify the goals of social justice campaigns. They are a tool as well as a set of aspirations. And over time, I think that that tool has allowed us to be more and more powerful, as long as it doesn't restrict our thinking about what kind of tactics we use in order to advance our cause. Let me just say, yes, so I made my name internationally running a boycott. It wasn't because I carefully chose the tactic of a boycott. It's just in the 1970s, if you were going to fight a company, you did a boycott. You know, there was nothing creative about it. It's just what you did. In fact, there were 120 boycotts in the US at the same time. The trick was learning actually how to do it over time, because most of them aren't very successful. And in particular, the idea that to fight a transnational company, we had to be transnational. And that's what pushed us to be the first international boycott, but also to begin working in networks around the world so we could operate together. So I think it's related to new tactics. I think the important issue is that over the last 40 years, we've learned a lot more about corporations. We started the boycott because we had the illusion as leftists that companies were perfect profit-maximizing institutions, and therefore they would understand only that they lost sales and profits. Well, it turned out they weren't smart enough to measure what kind of impact we had, because that wasn't what a transnational company was. Instead, I think John Kenneth Galbraith said best, it's a profit-sufficing group, that they just have to make enough profits for the management to retain control of the company and all of the benefits of being these powerful men. And that meant, in fact, there were many, many different elements about the corporate culture that initially we didn't understand that turned out to be rich sources of tactics and pressure. The most fascinating experience I had was meeting with their anti-boycott people after the boycott and them telling me what worked so that we'd go after their competitors more effectively. But with the UN guidelines, with the experience of so many different people learning to take on corporations, with the expansion of methods of law that have been tried, but also with other kinds of pressures that citizens can make, I think we've learned a lot, and we have an opportunity to fight, to use these institutions in new ways and in positive ways for change. And here's one cost to Nestle that I didn't know about until afterwards. They said that before the boycott, they could go to Harvard Business School and get the best students. But during the boycott, they couldn't get into any of the top business schools. They couldn't recruit anyone, because who would want to be associated with them? And so they internally began to measure the loss of management future. So in other words, thinking about their institution and different ways to weaken their power. That was very important, but it also, I think for me, was a source of amazement and aha opportunity. And we see young people more and more who want to go into corporations, but want the corporations to do well. So now we can structure allies within companies that we couldn't before, and we can be more optimistic.
That's great. I want you to say a few more words about the new tactics in human rights, and maybe you can also comment on what you think works well as a strategy or a tactic in a human rights movement and what doesn't, because we will all be working in the field and we want to get your ideas about what the best strategies are.
Well, I teach strategy at the Kennedy School, and what I would say is there's no such thing as the best strategy, because strategy is a set of decisions about who you target, what your tactics are, what your timing is. It's who your adversary is, who you are, what the terrain is, and that's always distinct and unique. Tactics, we contend, are transferable, they're usable, but the formation of strategy is unique. And that's also because of that intimate link. It's so important that organizations are not content with doing one or two tactics. It's so important to build a broad tactical repertoire because it increases our view of what strategies are possible. If we know how to do more things, we can do a better job of choosing our targets and choosing the right tactic, not the one that we know how to do, but the one that's called for in this situation. Is Shebnem still here? No, okay, so I can embarrass her. So, an example of new tactics and new tactics thinking. So, Shebnem was the president of the Forensic Doctors Association. And I got invited back in 1995 to come to Turkey, the first time I'd been here since 1970. It was fascinating to be back, but it was specifically for a meeting of forensic doctors. And it turns out there had never been a meeting of the Turkish forensic doctors together. So, extraordinary thing, and they all work for the government, right? And they had the responsibility to examine a prisoner and testify whether torture had occurred or not. And of course, they weren't doing it. So they began launching the idea here, number one, at this conference, where I met Murat Jelikan for the first time and other friends over time. But the idea was, first, to train the doctors on how to recognize different kinds of torture that were common in Turkey, falaka and so forth. But then the second idea was pushing medical ethics, and that was, if you see these kinds of wounds, not to report them as falaka is malpractice, medical malpractice. And there was an electric current that went through the doctors to be told that they're committing medical malpractice. So we're beginning two parts of a tactic, a pretty typical one for a professional organization: educate and then talk ethics. But we were able to introduce some concepts that were happening with other medical associations around the world. So we go from two tactics to, the doctors are actually frightened to give a report because when they give the exam, the police is right there. And so Shebnem said, well, you know, we have to have a protocol, a medical protocol, and step one, it should be in all the exam rooms, and step one is everybody has to leave, so that the doctor could point to the protocol and say to the police, and I'm sorry, but I can't do this exam unless you leave, because it's right here in my protocol. So first issue, how do we protect the doctor? But also we found out, none of the forensic doctors had cameras. They didn't even know how to document torture. So we give them cameras, we train them how to do it, we add another tactic. But it's not sufficient only to do the positive, it's also important to use a stick. So one of those sticks was that the association controlled the ability of a doctor to go to an international forensic doctors meeting. And if you were not fulfilling your ethical obligations, you just couldn't go anymore to a meeting. Then the Medical Association, looking at what happened in Argentina and Chile and Uruguay, said if the doctors are not fulfilling their duty, their license to practice should remove. So that added, and then of course the development of the Istanbul Protocol, which brought international standards more clearly into the issue. So normally organizations do one thing, and we hope that that solves the problem. Shebnem now has 7 active tactics surrounding the problem, really looking at it as, how do I solve this problem? How do I invent something new? How do my tactics reinforce each other so they actually create change? And Ken asked the question, how do you keep your, I think it was you, how do you keep motivated to do things and keep going? You should have seen Shebnem at that point. She was a fireball. She was so excited about thinking about these new ideas, and implementing them and creating the next thing and the next thing. And she developed the expectation of innovation. And that excited her, so she got out of bed in the morning and went out to the fight. So I think it's really important also to understand the role of tactics to motivate ourselves. If we do the same thing over and over again, we get bored. And what's more than that, our opponent, the government, learns how to deal with our tactic. So what's really critical is to be flexible, to do something new because it's more fun, because it's more exciting, and because the government doesn't know what to do, they're more likely to make a mistake. And that's the way we seize the initiative again. And so the importance we talk about in strategic thinking is building a tactical repertoire, a broad repertoire, and that comes about not only sitting down and studying a book or going to a workshop, it comes from collaborating with other organizations that have their own tactical repertoire and forcing each other to begin the question, how do we use our tactics together? What's our timing look like? Instead of fighting who's got the right tactic, the question is, so how do we use them together? Isn't this more interesting? Isn't this more fun? So the new tactics, when we did the conference with all of the work of Helsinki Citizens Assembly, the Human Rights Association, the Medical Association, and others, it was a very exciting event. We did presentations on 100 tactics, saying, okay, human rights, we usually do 3 or 4 things, here's 100. And now the database on new tactics is, I think, over 300 different tactics. You don't have to learn all of them, but it is an opportunity to go in and help yourself think more flexibly and therefore more powerfully than you might otherwise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before I started the panel, I was going to say something and I forgot because I feel awed by the presence of such a wonderful group of panelists here. What I was going to say was I'm a last-minute substitute, as was announced, for Ahmet İnsel, and I know many of you here know him, and that you all realize that I'm a poor substitute for him, and for that I apologize. And whatever shortcomings the moderator has, I think will be amply compensated by the powerful talks that are given by the panelists. So can we just continue? And you're next in line, so I'm going to pass to you. You're the executive director of Human Rights Watch for many years, and you've been witnessing things going on around the world from that perspective for a long time. Now, the media brings us all the time powerful images, often disturbing, of what's happening around the world. For example, I remember being shocked by the image of this poor little boy that lies dead on the Turkish shore, that he was among one of the groups that were trying to escape to Greece and never made it. So we always get these powerful images from the media. We hear lots of things going on, and we have a tendency to think that we are living in an era of the most horrible violations of human rights, the biggest forced migrations of people, and we always think about superlatives with respect to our own age. And Catherine sort of referred to that in her keynote speech also, how much of this we amplify, how much of this is real. So my first question to you is, from your perspective, are today's conflicts and crises fundamentally different from those before, or are they more difficult to manage than those before, or is it always the same?
Certainly not always the same. Now I think that we're facing two, relatively new challenges that are related, but they're distinct. I mean, one is the challenge of autocratic populists, which is actually a bit of an existential challenge for the human rights movement. I mean, I define an autocratic populist as somebody who gains power by demonizing some unpopular minority. The particular minority can vary from place to place. With Trump, it's Mexican immigrants. With a number of European leaders, it's Muslim refugees. In President Sisi, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. With Aung San Suu Kyi and the Burmese military, it's the Rohingya. Here it's the Gulenists. So there's always somebody, and they're always used as a scapegoat for the country's problems. Once the autocrat gets into power, then they go to step 2 of the autocrat's handbook, and they start undermining the checks and balances on their executive authority. So they start attacking the independence of the judiciary. They try silencing the critical media. They try shutting down civic society. They try imprisoning opposition politicians. And you see this almost every place, including in this country. So now, what makes this a particular challenge is that the human rights movement is used to shining a spotlight on misconduct. And we do that because most governments think of respect for human rights as an element of their legitimacy. And we all know that they violate human rights, but they at least pretend to respect human rights. And so if we can show the discrepancy between what they're pretending to do and what they're really doing, that's embarrassing, and that tends to delegitimize them. They hate that, and you begin to put pressure on them. The challenge with the autocratic populists is they've made certain human rights violations popular. So if you go to Viktor Orban and say, "You're mistreating those Muslim immigrants," he would say, "Yep." And his followers would applaud rather than condemn him. So, that's challenge number one, is how do we convince people that even when the victim is unpopular, that we need to defend them? And there are various ways to do that. You can do it by showing the pattern that tends to happen, that, the autocrats always begin with the unpopular minority, but then they turn to the more mainstream critics. And, before you know it, you're being imprisoned. It wasn't just the unpopular minority. Or you can show how, the autocrat pretends to be serving the people, but almost inevitably, as he, and it's usually a he, undercuts the checks and balances on his authority, that, they begin to be self-serving. They begin to be corrupt. Suddenly you have these massive infrastructure projects that, help the cronies but are indebting the people. And this is a pattern that you see playing out almost in every one of these countries. So, there's an educational role that we have to play in addition to our classic investigation and exposing and shaming. Now, the second challenge today is that in addition to this shaming process, the human rights movement traditionally has looked to certain powerful partners to help us put pressure on abusive governments. And there's no such thing as a clean partner. There's no such thing as a consistent partner. But certain governments we could turn to more often than not. These days, the U.S. government is usually worthless. The idea of turning to Donald Trump and saying, "Would you help us promote human rights?" is almost laughable. Or you go to the British government, and they're too busy with Brexit to bother with most of anything else. Macron, France, is, rhetorically good about human rights and supporting it, except when French commercial or anti-migration or counterterrorism interests are at stake, which is a lot of countries. So if there's nothing at stake, the French will help. Merkel is good, but only for certain countries. Germany doesn't have the scope. So this has again presented a challenge. A lot of the traditional partners of the human rights movement are unavailable. And we've had to be creative. And so we've begun to go to a series of smaller and medium-sized governments and said, will you take the lead? And even though you don't have the clout of Washington or London or Paris, we'll help you build a coalition and we'll make things happen that way. So, for example, the lead government in initially last year getting an international investigation of the war crimes in Yemen, which really meant taking on the Saudis that nobody likes to do, the lead government was the Netherlands. And they were backed ultimately by Canada and Belgium and a few others, and we got the investigation. They're now trying to renew it this month at the UN Human Rights Council. The lead government in putting pressure on the Philippines has been Iceland. And Iceland has put together, a series of joint statements. And Duterte, started, denouncing those crybabies in Geneva. So he would, in a sense, try to belittle them, but he was really being hit by them. And he actually, for a number of months, moved drug enforcement away from the police who were doing all the summary executions to a more normal anti-drug agency that doesn't kill people. The most interesting story for me is, this is the last one, is that we've been trying to send Syria to the International Criminal Court. And Russia kept vetoing efforts at the UN Security Council. And it finally became clear that we were not going to get any place at the UN Security Council. So we thought, okay, we're going to go to the UN General Assembly, where there is no veto, and we're going to at least ask it to create a special Syria prosecutor, to start collecting the evidence and building the cases so that as a tribunal becomes available, we can prosecute people. And we started looking around and said, who wants to do this? Well, our lead partner was the superpower of Liechtenstein. Now, why Liechtenstein? Liechtenstein is so tiny that they don't do the usual thing of rotating their diplomats every 3 years. They don't have enough diplomats to rotate. So the guy in New York, the ambassador, Christian Benevasser, has been there for 15 years. He's the dean of the ambassadorial corps. He's very respected. He believes in international justice. He said, yeah, I'll take this on. And we worked with him. We built a coalition around mighty Liechtenstein, and we ended up winning that vote 105 to 15. And so today we have a Syria prosecutor based in Geneva collecting this evidence. It's called the International Impartial Investigative Mechanism, the IIIM, and a French prosecutor is doing this. So this is just an example, to use Doug's term, you've got to use sort of different tactics. You've got to be creative and flexible because there are big challenges. We have, the populist challenge. We have the void created by the lack of traditional leadership. It doesn't mean you give up. You just have to be creative and find other ways of doing it.
For you to comment on. And this is about the human rights institutions versus the human rights movements. And there is criticism that some human rights institutions have become big bureaucracies and they have become rather indifferent to the plight of the people that they are supposed to help. Now, Human Rights Watch is not like that. You have very strong ties with the local activists. So, do you have any advice about how to connect well with what's happening locally, how to connect with the local activists, and how to have the international organizations work together with the local groups?
Let me answer your question in two ways. I mean, first of all, anybody who does human rights work realizes that, a group like Human Rights Watch, which may seem like it's a big organization, in fact, when you scratch the surface, there's one or two people working on any given country. And my colleague here is basically, she's Human Rights Watch for Turkey. So, given that reality, you have to work with local groups. There's no choice. The local groups are the ones who are most in touch with what's happening. They're the ones who understand, what are the opportunities, what are the needs, where can we make a difference? And you've got to really collaborate in order to figure out how are we collectively going to make a difference. And, Human Rights Watch, we have certain things that we're good at. We're good at projecting things into the media. We're good at, working with certain international governments. You can't do any of that without the local partnerships. So it's absolutely, it's just essential to do that. Now, the other thing I just want to stress is that sometimes when people talk about international institutions, what they're talking about is international law or international legal things, or this or that treaty body, and those are all important. I don't want to belittle that, but because international human rights law has very little coercive power behind it. There's no human rights police force that's running around picking up the bad guys, or it's just. Especially in a country where the domestic system has been compromised, where the judges have been undermined. So the only real way that you can move a government is through its people. And the target of human rights advocacy has really got to be building public support for better respect for human rights. And sometimes you can't do it in the country in question because the country is completely shut off. So North Korea, you don't spend a lot of time building up public support in North Korea. That's kind of for the moment, a thankless venture. But most places, the key is actually finding ways to build support within the local population, because international human rights law is really only as powerful as international and really local and domestic and national public opinion backs these values. And that's why speaking in a way that resonates with the key population is absolutely essential for defending human rights effectively.
Thank you. Pass on to you. Now you are an academician and you study human rights. And we read a lot about people questioning the legitimacy of human rights. The idea is that there's a cultural component to it, in the sense that this is something that's created and concocted by the West, and it's a way of imposing Western values on East or global North values on the South. So, as a scholar of human rights, what do you think about it? Is there a cultural component to human rights, or is it absolutely universal? What are your comments on that?
Well, first, thank you for the question, because the first half of my book is about that issue. But don't worry, I won't launch into the first half of the book. If we talk about the idea of the international protection of human rights, a survey of the history of the international protection of human rights reveals that that idea really did not come from the United States and Western Europe. That idea appears for the first time in the UN Charter, and it was put there by the small states. So the small states were there from the beginning. It was put in the UN Charter by the small states in San Francisco. The big powers in Dumbarton Oaks, the first draft of the UN Charter, did not want the legal international protection of human rights, because they were worried about what it would mean for their own empires, or in the US case, for segregation in the global South. And so if it had not been for 20 of the 50 countries came from Latin America and other small states, we would not have human rights mentioned 7 times in the UN Charter. And if not for that, all the later UN work is built on that. So actually, there's a lot of historical amnesia when people say that the idea of the international protection of human rights was imposed by the United States and Western Europe, who were at times actually in opposition to that idea.
I want to ask another relating to the United Nations activities in the past. This is about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was endorsed by the General Assembly, I think, at the end of the Second World War. Now, I've had it said that some people think that if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had not been introduced at that time, but was introduced today as a new concept, perhaps it would not have gained the support of as many countries as it did in the beginning. Of course, the number of countries has changed tremendously, but I want to hear your views on this, because in your keynote speech you also talked about the despair that we feel sometimes about the situation of the world. Are we being terribly pessimistic and magnifying the bad things, or is it real? So, what do you think would have happened?
Well, first I should say that I always like to stress that the first intergovernmental Declaration of Rights was not the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man, by which I mean the Latin American or the inter-American. It was 20 Latin American states plus the United States who in April 1948, 8 months before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, produced the first Intergovernmental Declaration of Rights. And all of the rights that are in this American Declaration later appear in the Universal Declaration. So it's again, an indication of agency from the Global South that's completely unrecognized. We had all the celebrations this year of the Universal Declaration. There were virtually no mention at all of the American Declaration. Even in Latin America, people aren't always aware of that declaration, in part because the dictatorships in Latin America kind of erased that memory. It was not convenient for the dictatorships to remember Latin American protagonism for human rights. So, but there were 50 countries only, as you say, the majority not from the global north, majority from what we today call the global south, but most of the countries of the world missing, of course, because of this mainly pre-decolonization. So yeah, I think yes, most of us would not want to have a situation where we try to open the Universal Declaration of Human Rights up again for negotiation, nor many of the early treaties, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Convention on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. It would not be a good idea to open those up today, because we might get treaties that are worse than what we have. Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
I wanted you to pass on because I had my chance to speak already today, but I did want to really say thank you to the audience and to all the presenters, because there were such fascinating presentations today from which I really have learned a lot. So I wanted to thank the other presenters and the questions.
So our last panelist, last but not least, is Albie Sachs. You played a very influential role in the development of the South African Constitution. You were appointed by Nelson Mandela to the Constitutional Court, and you were there for 15 years forging the new laws. Now, the anti-apartheid struggle was one of the most important human rights campaigns, but it was also an important example of accountability. So the first thing I want to ask you is, with respect to, for example, the role of truth commissions in South Africa, how would you compare the effectiveness of classical, traditional criminal trials and punishments versus other forms of restorative justice, which are more efficient in protecting human rights?
I'm going to ask your indulgence. I want to sing.
Go ahead.
Every talk I've given this year in South Africa has started in the way I'd love to do here. It's the centenary of the birth of Nelson Mandela. And if I can just do two things in my session here. The first is how I met Nelson Mandela, and the second would be how I was influenced by a Turk at about the same time, and why I feel I'm paying back, maybe with interest in the positive sense, the connection, very slight but turned out to be a very powerful Turkish connection. And I'm dealing with, I say to a South African audience, can you remember where you were on the 6th of April 1952? And there are not many people. That's like the French Revolution. But I'm saying that was the date in which the white racist government in South Africa was celebrating 300 years since Jan van Riebeeck came, planted the Dutch flag. And it was also a few years after the Afrikaner nationalist government had been put in power on the policy called apartheid, introducing it to the world for the first time. And the aeroplanes were flying overhead, the armored cars rolling through the streets. And there were about 200 people in a small town hall with a higher roof than this, 190 black and 10 white, and we were singing. And the songs were very sad songs. My boye, my boye, my boye, Africa, come back Africa. Senzenina, Senzenina, Senzenina, Senzenina. What have we done? What have we done? And suddenly it's Dr. Morocco, Dr. Dadu, J.B. Marks, Katani Liber Papi. Volunteers obey the orders. Be ready for the action now. Volunteers obey the orders. And they're calling for volunteers. It's the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign. And this is my way of communicating to an audience in South Africa today the world in which our participation in the struggle took place. 6 particular laws. Black men had to have a document on them every moment of the day and night, produced on demand to any policeman, sleeping in bed in his home, walking in the streets, refusing to carry passes. Black people couldn't be out on the streets after curfew hour at night, going out after curfew. Seats reserved in post offices everywhere else, blacks and whites. 6 laws we're going to defy, and they're calling for volunteers. And I say to my friend Lütfi, I want to volunteer. You can't. Why? You're white. We're fighting racism. This is a black struggle led by black people. But the fact is that 6 months later, after I'd written my second year law school exams, I'm leading a small group into the post office in Cape Town to sit on seats marked non-whites only. Now, why do I mention this in connection with Mandela? I was volunteer number 8,432, and volunteer number 1 was Nelson Mandela. We would never have met if it hadn't been for the Defiance campaign. And I ask people, what's the one good thing that apartheid did? And they get a little bit worried because one of our politicians is in trouble for saying that colonialism wasn't all bad. It brought us railways and something else. She's finished now as a politician. I think I might be going down that road. And I say apartheid created anti-apartheid. And I, growing up, grandchild of immigrants who'd fled from oppression as Jews in Europe, in Cape Town, cosmopolitan, I'm joining in a campaign with Nelson Mandela, who'd grown up in rural Transkei area. We would never have met, but we came together. We came together through the Defiance campaign. And it was so significant. We met afterwards, years later, writing the Constitution together. Later on, as a judge, I was part of 11 judges who struck down a very important proclamation by Nelson Mandela, which he accepted so graciously and said, I must be the first to show respect for the Constitutional Court decision on our Constitution. So our constitutionalism then is embedded in law breaking, and the lawbreakers who had resisted oppression, internalizing the importance of overcoming oppression, and decisions we took inside our own ranks not to use torture against captured enemy agents, and creating a kind of code of conduct, almost like a Bill of Rights for the ANC in exile, a moral position being taken then, not to go in, as I think I mentioned earlier, for terrorism, terrorist attacks, because we wanted a country. All of these themes weaving together, and Albie and Mandela can claim in our different ways we were involved in that journey. The Turkish contact. It was a poet. His name was Nazım Hikmet. And we devoured Nazım Hikmet in our little youth movement in Cape Town. And the importance of it was not just this was beautiful poetry by a revolutionary. The image growing up in a British-controlled educational system about Turkey was negative. And it went with the racism and anti-Islamic, a whole range of different things. And here is this beautiful voice. It's poetic, it's romantic, it's intellectual. And it also was part of our coming to internationalism. So the internationalism wasn't just the workers of the world unite, people are oppressed, we're all in one kind of thing. It's people like us, it's idealists all over the world, in their own idiom, with their different languages, with their different cultural settings, but all struggling for a more emancipated humanity. And that was a marvelous gift for me, 17 years old, coming into the struggle, being invested with that whole kind of the imagery, the imagination, the love. And he didn't just write about injustice and for justice. And he didn't just write about people's power and solidarity. He wrote about love. He wrote about the puzzling things of life. He wrote about the incongruities of life. He wrote about paradoxes. And that was telling us, if you want to be in the struggle, if you want to be, we didn't call ourselves human rights activists, we were freedom fighters then, but if you want to be in the struggle for an emancipated humanity, don't lose your own humanity. Don't become dour. Don't become heavy. Don't become so serious that there's no fun, there's no joy, there's no sparkle, there's no puzzle, there's no surprise in your life. And these were some of the elements that came through your Turkish poet, Nazım Hikmet. So thank you, Turkey, and thank you, Hrant Dink, for putting on this absolutely fabulous, fabulous, fabulous day for all of us. I brought with me probably the most powerful gift one can bring from South Africa. It's a copy of our Bill of Rights. And if anybody wants to think about the universality of human rights, just look at our Bill of Rights. It was a parliament of black people overwhelmingly, 90%, 80% black, mostly very humble origins, mostly poor, but we had clerics, we had writers, we had medicos and others. And it was the first constitution in the world to say that any discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation is unfair discrimination, unlawful. That was 1994. It was the first constitution in the world, I think, to include the right to a healthy environment and sustainable development. It was the first constitution in the world, in the clause dealing with freedom, to say freedom includes not only the right not to be detained without trial, to be locked up, and so on, but the right not to be subjected to violence from public or private sources. Private sources. To this day, that's not seen as part and parcel of a fundamental right. It's very expansive on social and economic rights, and we were probably the first court, as a court, to enforce social and economic rights as fundamental human rights. This was an African parliament, overwhelmingly black Africans involved. These were rights for people throughout the world. These are aspirations of people throughout the world, and it gives me enormous, enormous pleasure to ask if Mama, as African term we use, Mama Rakel, could come forward on behalf of the foundation to receive it from me.
Thank you very much. Herkese çok teşekkürler.
Ben çok teşekkür edeceğim bütün katılımcılara ama özellikle bu güzel anayasa için o üzerindeki ağaç amblemi de ayrıyeten hepimizi kapsadığı için çok duygulandım. Biz de o ağacın bir parçası olarak dileğim. Bu ülkemizde de bu anayasanın geçerli olduğu günü kutlayarak bugün başlıyoruz.
Our panelists one more time for being with us today, and we hope to see them in our future, maybe 15 years, 20 years, whenever it takes. Katılımcılara ve izleyenlere de çok teşekkür ediyorum. Uzun bir gündü, zor bir gündü. Hepinize
It was a very long day, it was a very tiring day, and I'd like to thank you all for your patience.